We're delighted to have so many of you join us this afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us. My name is Julie Cafley, and I'm the Executive Vice President at the Public Policy Forum. And we're really delighted to have such an engaged and full room this afternoon for a release of a very important report at a timely moment. Before beginning, I'd like to acknowledge our partners, the Future Skills Center, the Diversity Institute, ESDC, the Black Business and Professional Association, and Deloitte, who have all played a role in helping this event come together today. We're really delighted. And of course, I really feel it's important to do a virtual land acknowledgement. Of course, the Public Policy Forum is based in Ottawa, and so we're on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. And I think particularly in a discussion like we're having today, it's really important to realize the differences in terms of items like the wage gap related to Indigenous women, where we're seeing Indigenous women working full-time, full year, earn on average 35% less than non-Indigenous men, so 65 cents to $1. So just putting that in the context of the land acknowledgement, and today's discussion, it really does tell an important story, and a story that we need to look at fixing, frankly. I think one of the most important themes of today is that this is not a discussion about social justice, it's a discussion about the economy. And I think the number that I just gave you speaks to that quite clearly. Today we have a very full room, we have a fantastic room of amazing leaders. Of course, 90% of them are women, and I think that we're long beyond the fact of this being a women's issue as well. This is an issue for the economy, this is an issue for all Canadians, and we really need to change that narrative. Today we're going to record the session just so that you're aware. There is an opportunity for questions and answers, so please feel free to add them into the question and answer. And the report being released today is part of our Skills Next series at the Public Policy Forum that we're doing in collaboration with the Future Skills Center and the Diversity Institute. And you will receive a report entitled Economic Equality in a Changing World, Removing Barriers to Employment for Women. You'll be receiving that right after the session today. And of course, the timing of this event is very apropos. In the past week, we saw the loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And in terms of women in work, she was a trailblazer. And we've all been reading amazing articles and learning about her more and more over the past week. Of course, under her leadership and her knowledge and her activism, things like mortgages, bank accounts, credit cards, business loans without a male co-signer all became possible. Women were able to keep a job while pregnant, and get a job without sterilization. They were able to get birth control without permission from their husband. And of course, it's both, I think, a bit ironic and beautiful that in much of the discussions regarding Ruth Bader Ginsburg, that there was some credit given to her partner, Marty Ginsburg. And today we're going to talk a lot about the roles of partners in supporting women in the workplace. And a book came out recently in the UK talking about the fact that many women marry their glass ceilings, and the relationship of a partner plays a huge role in terms of so many things, from childcare to running a family. And so that's an important discussion to have. And of course, this week we also had the throne speech, where we learned how COVID-19 is battering gender equality. We're seeing rising domestic abuse, and starting to see childcare being spoken of as economic policy. Of course, Quebec has experienced childcare policy for a long time. We know that it works, and yet multiple times we're discussing and rediscussing this issue, going back to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women, which was now 50 years ago. Since then, there's been many task forces. In 1986, the Katie Cook Task Force. In 1987, the Special Committee on Childcare that called for childcare in terms of women's economic empowerment. So the throne speech was also headed in that same direction, and we do certainly hope that that things advance beyond words, and good intentions are simply not enough. We also saw the Ontario Chamber of Commerce this week calling for daycare in terms of part of the feminist recovery as well. So the research that we're presenting today provides insight into 4 primary barriers that COVID has exacerbated: the wage gap, the underrepresentation of women in STEM, the absence of women in leadership, and the challenges facing women entrepreneurs. RBC's recent report has talked about this pandemic sending women back 3 decades in terms of labor force participation. So I'm delighted to be joined by some amazing leaders today that will help to unpack this report for you. Wendy Sukir, who is the Ryerson University's Diversity Institute founder. She's the academic director of the Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub and research lead at the Future Skills Center. She's a trailblazer and an amazing force behind so much of this work. And Wendy is with us today. Nadine Spencer, who's the CEO of Brand EQ and the president of BPPA. Zabine Ahirja, who's the executive advisor for the future of work for Deloitte. And Rachel Wernick. Rachel Wernick is a senior assistant deputy minister, skills and employment branch at ESDC. And I'm going to hand things over actually to Rachel first to kind of set the scene and provide her perspective on this discussion. So over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thanks for this opportunity. I feel so fortunate to share a Zoom stage with such an amazing group of expert women. And the Public Policy Forum and Diversity Institute has done an excellent report on removing barriers to employment. So I am going to focus my remarks from the perspective of working in public policy and the critical juncture I think we now find ourselves in. So it's clear that the evidence on the impact of the pandemic on women in the labor market presents both challenges and opportunities when it comes to women in employment. But first, let's just consider the scale of impact of the pandemic has had. From February to April 2020, 5.5 million Canadian workers were affected by the COVID-19 economic shutdown. Unfortunately, though, as we slowly return to greater economic activity, the growth in labor force participation to pre-COVID levels has not been equal for men and women. During May to August, men have reintegrated into the labor market much more quickly than women. And the data shows that among parents, employment recovery is slowest for mothers with school-aged children. Among those employed, women are more likely to be working significantly less than their usual hours. And the high rate of unemployment for women has underscored their concentration in several sectors characterized by low-skilled, low-paid jobs. Just to give one example, 3% of the accommodation and food services sector workforce is women, which is one of the hardest hit sectors. And then think about it, this rises to 90% when we look at the percentage of women in long-term care. And most importantly, these are sectors where racialized women are further concentrated in employment, leading to higher COVID-19 related job losses for racialized women. This picture that it painted by this data is very disturbing for me. During an incredibly difficult crisis, it's women that have experienced greater hardship. And this is even more true for racialized women. All of us on this panel have been underscoring the enduring gender gaps in the labor market from our various vantage points. But I do think now we're at a critical juncture. I think that there's a risk that we slide back and retrench inequalities. So the challenge that we're facing as a country is how to leverage the awareness of these impacts of the pandemic to make the case for fundamental change. So I'd like to speak to what I see as 3 key public policy issues that have been highlighted by the pandemic. The first one is that paradox. Essential services provided by women, but how are they rewarded in the labor market? We now have the most compelling evidence of the critical nature of paid caregiving jobs to the economy. The societal cost of poor pay and working conditions for these jobs has been highlighted by the tragic loss of life in seniors' homes and emergency measures to top up wages for caregiving workers. Workers providing critical caregiving supports often themselves have been constrained by limited childcare adapting to school closures. They've faced tough choices between earning an income caring for others and caring for their own family members. Personal support workers who provide the majority of hands-on care are an unregulated workforce, largely composed of women, often recent immigrants, and characterized by low pay, poor benefits, irregular hours. In other professions, workforce development, mobility, it's supported by common training, quality standards, and certifications. This is just not the case for these workers. While some jurisdictions have their own standardized, accredited curriculum, there's no consistency across the country. There's over 20 different job titles, different entry requirements, duration of training varying from 15 to 14 weeks, no national occupational standards. I do think standardization and quality curriculum is key to professionalizing occupations, improving work conditions, and ensuring decent pay. So I think there's an opportunity in the crisis of long-term care to improve access to quality common training, both for those already in the sector to improve their conditions and their mobility, and to put a concerted effort into training new recruits, given the acute shortages of staff that the sector is facing. Which leads me to my second issue, which is what I refer to as the skills trap. Without greater access to skills training, women will have a hard time getting out of these low-skilled, low-paid jobs and improving their lot. Access to training for women of diverse backgrounds is fundamental in these sectors, but also for all women, and especially for women who want to transition from declining sectors to growing ones. We all know that the imperative for upskilling had already existed. We talk about the changing nature of work, rising technology, rising importance of transferable skills such as digital skills. But the current labor market context has only accelerated its importance. And access to training and employment supports for women, and particularly racialized women, is going to be key to ensure that women don't fall further behind. So just conscious of time, I will raise a final issue that is near and dear to my heart, and which I unfortunately continue to see evidence of all of the time. It's something I've referred to in the past as the hidden default. What I mean by that is our point of departure for considering policy, program design, and our efforts often uses the male experience as the baseline, the male-driven data as the baseline. It's often that we don't test our assumptions and our unconscious bias as we think about how to address these issues. I'm encouraged to see that there is some commitment to even more investment in disaggregated data, which is sorely lacking and greatly impedes our ability to do good gender-based analysis and diversity analysis. But even if we have the data, we need to keep the awareness of this unconscious bias, of this hidden default front and center as we consider actions, policy, and to ensure that we have the most effective and inclusive policies and programs possible. To me, it's a big part of this is awareness. It's just constantly reminding people of that baseline, of that hidden default. And I think that conversations like we're going to have today and important research reports like we're going to discuss today are primarily the biggest and one of the most important ways we can keep that hidden default front and center. So thank you so much for the opportunity to participate. I look forward to a great discussion.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Merci beaucoup pour les grandes idées qu'il faut vraiment observer puis réaliser, and I really look forward to the discussion as well. It's really so important to have a champion like you behind issues like this within the work that we're doing. So thank you so much. I'm just going to switch over to my presentation in terms of just doing an initial presentation of the report that we are releasing today. As I mentioned, you'll receive a copy of it following the presentation today, and we look forward to sharing it. It exists in both French and English, and there's a lot of important information. In many ways, it's a review of a lot of research that is out there, and seeing the numbers and seeing the facts together really tell a story. And of course, with the COVID lens, it becomes all the more dramatic. So the question of economic equality in a COVID context is complex, it's multi-layered, and obviously intersectional as well. And as I mentioned at the outset, the Diversity Institute has been a key driver of much of this research. And I want to applaud them for being bold, for being solution-oriented and being pragmatic. I think that there's lots to be concerned about, but I think in terms of every challenge that is presented, the Diversity Institute and Wendy Sukier in particular look for solutions and look for ways of improving the situation. A big shout out to my co-authors who have been very involved in the publication of this report. Katie Davy, Ruby Latif, Simon Blanchette, Tanya Saba, and Valentina Sitnik, colleagues and academics from Ryerson, Université de Montréal, and the Public Policy Forum. Thank you for all playing a role in this important publication and for your commitment to the issues. So of course, within this report, women remain a minority in senior corporate roles. We've talked already, and Rachel's mentioned the domestic workloads and reduced career opportunities compared to men. And of course, this pandemic has blown all of those numbers out of the water. It's been much more devastating to women, to their careers, and to their labor market involvement. We talk about an increase in caring responsibilities, a disruption to working hours, job security, and their paid work capacity. And of course, this is most acute for parents with children under the age of 12. Women from diverse backgrounds have additional barriers to entry, retention, and progression in the workforce. This is a huge concern. Looking ahead at potential cutbacks around diversity programs makes it all the more concerning. So we can go to the next slide, Heba. So this is just a bit of an idea of what we'll look at today. I'll present the first aspect of the presentation, and I'll hand things over to Wendy. So we've talked a lot about the burden of unpaid work, preventing many from returning to work. A report was released recently that 33% of women have considered not returning to the workforce during COVID and have questioned their involvement in work. We're talking about reduced productivity and a reduction of talent available to employers. Of course, Canada continues to have one of the highest gender wage gaps as well. This really helps to underline the economic issue that we're discussing today. Heba, you can put. So in terms of the wage gap, here's just some important numbers. So women are at 87% of the wage gap compared to men. And this is despite significant increases in post-secondary education. And the numbers there are really, really quite fascinating. I'm just going to pull them up. So essentially, if you're comparing the numbers between 1990 and 2015, the rate of women with university degrees went from about 14% to 35%. In that exact same period, so those 25 years, the numbers for men went from 17%, so they were already 4% higher, and their numbers rose to about 28.6%, so much lower. So despite the fact that women are seeking further education, that have more university degrees, the wage gap is still really quite dramatic. And of course, this is just amplified when you're looking at racialized women, Indigenous women, and women with disabilities. And those numbers, frankly, are upsetting to all of us, I'm sure. And they tell a story that you essentially can't dispute because it's facts and it's numbers. There's a significant portion of this that's related to the highest paid roles in the country. So a recent Financial Post article found that out of the most 100 highest paid CEOs, we only have 4 women on that list. So that immediately affects the gender gap. You know, there's other factors as well, that women are less likely to work full-time than men. They're more likely to occupy lower paying jobs and then less likely to progress in their career. In fact, it said that men advance in their career 3 times faster than women. Okay, the wage gap for ethnic, racialized people, immigrants, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities is obviously even more severe, as the numbers show really clearly. Racialized minorities are disproportionately employed in lowest paying sectors, such as accommodation and food services. Recent female immigrants are 3 times more likely to obtain paid part-time work and 2.5 times more likely to obtain temporary work versus non-immigrant women. And unfortunately, we're still living in a country where job applicants with foreign sounding names are 20 to 40% less likely to get a callback. So we're talking about foundational issues in terms of racism. The numbers here in terms of women entrepreneurs, which Wendy will get into later, 16% are majority owners, 38% self-employed, concentrated in service sectors. Okay, I'll go on to the next slide. So women are also underrepresented in leadership positions. The number there that comes out of some work from the Diversity Institute shows how white women outnumber racialized women of 12 to 1 on corporate boards. And the next slide will actually show you how that equals out on diversity on boards. But here on the chart, and this chart is included in the report as well, you see the numbers around women and men in terms of entry-level positions where we see 50-50, going up to CEO where we see 86 and 14. Unfortunately, these numbers are not a surprise to most of us, but they really are quite dramatic. And I think, you know, beyond the wage gap, beyond the numbers, beyond the economic issues, it's the societal expectations that are linked to this as well. For women and for shaping the aspirations of young women, the fact that they're not seeing women in these roles has a dramatic effect on how they shape their careers and their plans and moving forward. So the importance of women's empowerment in all of this is very important. We'll go on to the next slide. I have a So in terms of diversity on boards, this is a fascinating chart. Here you can see the diversity on boards. So we can see that university and colleges are perhaps doing a bit better, but overall the numbers are not nearly where they should be, and especially for racialized people on boards. You can see the the yellow dotted line, which shows the percentage of racialized people in Canada. And obviously their board representation falls far below those numbers. So not nearly where they need to be. The fact that women are well represented in many sectors underscores the issue that that's not the pool of candidates, but rather corporate policies and practices and a need to reach out to more racialized people. And of course, there's been plenty of work that's done, plenty of research that's shown that there are jurisdictions that are making advances for diversity and inclusion, but it takes a plan, it takes numbers, it takes a clear strategy, authentic engagement, and you know, going beyond box checking in terms of really ensuring this representation, and not only the actual diversity, but the inclusion, and actually ensuring that these voices are heard when they're at the table and that they're fully engaged is so important. So we'll go on to the next slide, Heba. So the first step, we've gone over that already, but when you're talking about, there was a recent study in the Globe and Mail talking about that only 15 companies out of 73, so 20.54%, have a woman CEO or the equivalent, and only one of those is in a company over $5 billion in revenue. Also, the final number is what Rachel was referring to earlier. 24% of AI professionals are women, and this has dramatic effects in the way that technology is built and carried out. And the representation there, that comes from a study from LinkedIn that is really quite dramatic as well in terms of underrepresentation. Okay, we'll go on to the next slide, Heba. You know, I've repeated it again and again, but in terms of the economic policy around this, if women participated in equal numbers to men in the labor force, we're talking about an economic output of about $1 billion per year. And I think that just goes undisputed, and it's simply, you know, essential. Within the pandemic, women in dual earning incomes are more likely to lose their jobs and less likely to recover in stimulus and rehiring initiatives. So COVID-19 has put a stress where there are a lot of women, lower earning jobs, higher representation in services, frontline jobs. 47% of women lost their jobs between February and June. They typically earn less than $2,000 a month. The closure of schools put pressure on women. One study showed that women are twice as likely as men to take on the homeschooling and the caregiving responsibilities, and especially for those women who make up 81% of single parent families. Yeah, those numbers speak for themselves. But we'll advance the slides. So in terms of employment, I've mentioned already the 33% of women that have considered leaving their jobs because of childcare. Women account for 45% of the decline, but only 35% of the recovery. So it's been acknowledged that women are bearing the brunt of COVID-19. More recent recessions have seen higher unemployment rates for men than for women, but as the statistics have shown, the current recession has been dubbed as a she-cession. We are responding with appropriate responses in terms of the Government of Canada, but there's frankly still much to be done. We'll go on to the next slide. In terms of the industries that are really affected during the crisis, this slide speaks for itself in terms of the representation, the female share of the industry versus the male share of the industry, specifically for the top two, accommodation and food, as well as with retail. And of course, you see it again in healthcare and social assistance, where women are more highly represented in terms of the numbers, and these are the industries that are most affected within the COVID-19 crisis. And on to the final slide, Heba, if you can just advance. You know, if we look at tech in particular, and Wendy's going to get into this a lot more in the coming slides, women are underrepresented in high tech. These are high-paid areas where there's high growth. You know, I started out my career working in a faculty of engineering where we talked about, you know, increasing the numbers, and we had all sorts of programs. You know, there's fewer women in computer science and are only marginally more in engineering today than there were 30 years ago. So despite efforts, despite investment, despite scholarships, we're still seeing very little growth in that area. And so just really important to consider in terms of an area where there is such high growth, and that women are not at the table as much as they should be. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Wendy to talk a bit more about skills and the digital divide.